So this is a video on the LYRA Opaque Pan Watercolor set. You can find a link to this particular set in the description of this video. This is my favorite set that I buy for my students when it comes to pan watercolors. They're very affordable and I think that quality is really awesome. So I actually like using these for myself too, not just my students. So here opening up the set, just so you can see kind of what it looks like. It does come with a paintbrush. It's not the greatest brush in the world, but actually it's kind of nice for some like dry brush textures, so we'll come back to that in a minute. You also get a tube of white watercolor. You'll notice there's no actual pan of white. And you'll notice there is a second tray. They do pop out, and there is a name for each color too. It's a little tricky to see, but it is on there too. So just to kind of show you, see this one a little bit better. You can see the names along each color there. And then the lid actually does pop off if you want to take it off for cleaning purposes, but this is a mixing palette so that you can mix your colors, and then you can of course snap this back on. So I actually use the lid of the palette quite often, so that comes in handy that you can take it on and off for easy cleaning. So let's go ahead and try some simple watercolor techniques just to see how these paints work. So I'm just using some basic watercolor paper here, trying a wet on wet technique. I am using a mop paintbrush, so I do want to note that the colors are just naturally lighter because of this particular paintbrush. But as I switch up the brush here, notice how the color is a lot more opaque, bold, also less water in there. Here is some salt. So while the paint is really wet, sprinkle some salt in. You'll get some really cool effects this way. I do have another video too with more in-depth descriptions on each watercolor technique. So this next one is rubbing alcohol. This is a super fun technique. Several different ways you can apply the rubbing alcohol. Right here I'm just using a Q-tip from a jar. And you can also use a spray bottle too, which is super fun. So just a little spray bottle. It can be a particular watercolor spray bottle, or it could just be like a little something you get 99 cents at Target. So just spritz that in. Again, make sure your color's nice and wet and saturated on the paper. Just kind of blotting up some of the excess with paper towel. Dry brush. So actually here I'm using the paintbrush that came with the set just to kind of show you some of the textures that you can create. Here's a little bit more water, whereas a little bit less water, you're seeing a little bit more texture, the bristles of the paintbrush. So you can kind of play around with that. I think it's fun layering up the dry brush to create different textures. I really like that. Here's wax resist. This is with a crayon. I'm using a white crayon on paper. And then in just a moment here, when I'm finished, I will take some watercolor paint and make sure it's nice and watered down too, so it actually covers over top of the crayon. But then you can create a wash over top, and the wax resists the paint. For variation, you can try using a sponge and applying the paint with a sponge instead of a brush. So I like to kind of tap some on. A little bit more water is going to create like a softer look. A little less water, you're going to see the texture a little bit more, so play around with that. Try layering it, different colors together. Sometimes I'll let it dry and then layer more color over top with the sponge. So just have fun and play around with that. Another tool you could try would be a toothbrush. There's a couple different ways you can use this. You can actually kind of flick and splatter the paint. Make sure too that you have water on the brush, and you can also kind of just create some different lines and texture and paint with it that way too, so that's kind of fun. Layering up colors, again, always a fun thing to do with watercolor, but try out some different textures. You could also try a straw. So pool on some watercolor on your paper. Make sure there's lots of water mixed in here so that the paint is nice and fluid. And then with a straw, you can just blow into it and create some different kind of fun streaks, very organic. Try a Q-tip. That's another variation, something else you could try. So there's some fun things you could do with that. Some little textures. You could layer it, blend it, but just have fun and experiment. LYRA watercolor is amazing. I think the colors are really rich, pigmented. Lots of fun things you can do with it. So highly recommend, super affordable, great set. So let's go ahead and paint a baby Yoda with some LYRA opaque pan watercolors. I did start with a quick pencil sketch, and here I'm beginning with light washes of color. I'm going to continue the painting by adding on more layers of watercolor. Here we go.